As you can see, I've got the primer coats complete on the boat right now. Now this is 2 coats of epoxy 2-part primer. The first coat came out a little orange peely because I put it on a little thick and I sanded that. It really wasn't a problem at all. The second coat I brushed and it did come out a lot better, like I had said before, and it was easier to sand. I think it dried a little bit faster, and you know, actually the reducer would extend the drying time, but I think over a course of time it dries a little bit better because it's on a little bit thinner. So it did sand better the next day, and it came out really nice. There's a very few spots where I've sanded through the primer and you can see the Kevlar, but it's not an absorbent surface, so the finish paint should probably cover that. And if not, you know, I could always put 2 coats of finish paint on this boat, but I'm hoping that 1 coat will do the trick. It's really relies on how good I can get that coat on there. Now, I'm not a professional painter by any stretch of the imagination. I've painted very few things, but, you know, I'm like a lot of people. I learn as I go, and, you know, I've learned quite a bit in the last few paint jobs that I've done, really, because I've never used polyurethane paint in my whole life, really, and a couple of times, you know, I've made a few videos about using polyurethane paint, and it's always the same thing. You know, there's a saying that goes along with polyurethane paint that less is more. Well, you know, I never could quite figure that out exactly, but, you know, and I know it has some validity, so I'm thinking to myself, well, why is that? Well, it's got to do really with putting too much paint on at once. When you do that, what happens is you get too much weight of paint on there. And usually what happens is because you don't have enough reducer in it. So what happens is you're spreading on too thick of a coat, and then what happens is the surface of it kind of goes off on you, so it's drying on the surface and you can't tip it, and it's the weight of the paint underneath the surface that runs, right? And it runs down under the surface, and you'd think, well, there it is, it's wet, it's running, and I can tip it off of there, but you can't because it drags. So what you want to do is get it reduced down to where you don't have that as a problem, so that you put on a little bit thinner coat, and I think that that's going to make it really work out really nicely. So, you know, that's from the very small amount of experience that I've had painting with polyurethane paint. I think that this is the key to it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to mix up some paint and I'm going to reduce it down a little bit before I even start painting and see how it goes. This is what we're going to be using for our topside paint. Now, it's Wet Edge 1-part polyurethane topside paint. I've used it before, and it works great. It requires that you know a few secrets, like I had said before. You don't want to put it on too thick. That's why they've come up with that less is more saying about polyurethane paint, and it's true. Now, I'm going to thin it with Special Brushing Thinner 100 because I don't want it to be so heavy, like I had said before, and I don't want it to skin over. This will make it last longer and stay wet longer, and it'll make it spread out easier. And I'm going to do the whole paint job on that boat with a brush. So I'm going to put my thinner over to the side, and I'm going to show you a quick little secret about shaking the paint. Now, I don't have a paint shaker, so what I'm going to do is shake it myself, and I could just pick it up and shake it, but I don't know. I don't really get that much of a shake out of it, so I'm going to put the corner of the can on the bench like this, roll it, and I shake it like that. That really makes a difference in how much it shakes up. Now I can turn it the other way and do the same thing, and I can feel the paint glugging on the bottom of the can, so I know it's fairly mixed up actually. So I think that's actually enough because this polyurethane paint doesn't separate very much in the first place. Now we're going to pop the top off our paint can here, and I'm going to poke some holes like you've seen me do many times before down into the lip of the paint can to let the paint run back down into the can. Once I've accomplished that, I'm going to start mixing. Now this is a little bit different way to mix paint than you see most people use. Sometimes I use a stick like in bottom paint. It's got a much bigger end on it to squash all the sediment in the bottom of the can. But this way here, I'm just using it to mix, and surprisingly enough, this is the easiest way to mix paint and not get it to come out of the can. it works pretty good. Going around like this, you can get it splashed out of the can pretty easily, but this paint's mixing up really nice. There's very little to no sediment whatsoever in it, so I think that's just about enough right there. Now, let me just pick up my stick and let it run off the end of the stick and see how thick I think this stuff is. Yeah, you see, that's fairly thick. It's too thick for my liking. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my gallon can here and I'm going to pour some into my paint pot. Now, you got to do this kind of quick so you don't make a mess. Like that. And then stop as quick as you can. And then clean it up as quick as you can. So it doesn't run down to the bench. Yeah, like that. Now, that'll just dry on the side of the can, and I can brush out the lip on the top of the can really easy because I've got those holes that I put in there. So I'm going to take care of that like that. Now I'm going to put my top back on. Move it over. Now I'm going to pour in some special brushing thinner. Oops, I spilled a little bit there, but that'll be all right. We don't have to spend much time mixing this thinner into the paint because the paint doesn't have any sediment in it, and it's not like mixing epoxy, so a few swirls and it's mixed. Now I'm just going to get started painting right back here on the bottom, really on the skeg itself, and see how that goes. I'm going to paint, I believe, the whole thing with a brush. If I get tired of this brush, this is 2.5 inches. I've got a 3-inch brush, and you'd be surprised, it makes quite a bit of difference, just that extra 1/2 inch. So I might switch over, but right now I'm just going to go at it with this one and see how we make out. Now that I've applied some of the paint onto this side of the skeg, I'm actually just going to tip it here and just see whether or not, when I tip it, if it wipes it away or whatever it does. And look at that, it really covers pretty nicely actually. So I think that's going to work out. The test is really to see whether or not it'll cover this bare darker color right here along the chine. Now I'm spreading paint right on the bottom itself. Goes along pretty quickly. The bottom certainly won't run because it's laying flat, so I can put quite a bit of paint on the bottom if I want, but I have to be very conservative when I get to the sides of anything so that I can make sure that I spread it out completely. Now, let me tip that a little bit, and I touch the side of the skeg again. There you go. Painting on the flat allows me to get a feel for the paint, to see how thick it is, what consistency it is, and see how easy it spreads. It gives me a chance, just to feel it out before I do start painting the sides of the boat. It's going on really well, and it's spreading out very easily. It covers really well. I've got the paint a little bit thick, and that's okay on the bottom of the boat because it certainly isn't going to run on the bottom. It's just too flat. It wouldn't matter how much paint I put on the bottom of the boat. It's going to look really, really good. So after I get the bottom of the boat painted, I have to decide whether or not I'm going to thin the paint down a little bit more to start painting the side. Okay, now I've applied the paint, and now what I'm doing is just tipping it a little tiny bit here. So I'm not trying to put more on or take any off. I'm just smoothing it out a little bit, and it really applied nicely. So I can't wait. That's on the flat now, so that's one test. It covers pretty good. Now the next thing we're going to do is start painting the vertical parts of it here, the sides of the boat. So that's really the acid test, is how well I can do that. Next thing I'm going to do before I do that, though, is paint the rest of the bottom on the other side. Another reason why I'm painting the bottom of the boat first is because if I had painted the sides of the boat first, I would have to reach over the wet paint job to paint the bottom. That just wouldn't work out well for me. I could drip paint on the paint job that I already put on the sides of the boat, and then I'd have to tip it. It could have been already going off a little bit. I could drip paint on it by mistake. I could rub myself or my arm or my shirt up against a paint job. Just about any number of things could happen that I don't want to happen. It won't work out really well at all. You paint the bottom of the boat first, and then you move on to the side. So I'm going to start on the bottom and work my way out from there. Now this is where you have to start becoming a little bit more careful, because we're on like a vertical surface now. So you have to go fast and you have to get it on reasonably thin. So you can't fail to tip it out. And just one other little trick here. Now somebody taught me many years ago not to put my brush in the paint and then just rub all the paint off on the pot. It wouldn't make any sense. So what you do is you put your brush in the paint and you just tap on both sides a little bit. That pretty much gets the right amount of paint on the brush. So you can see there's no huge reservoir running off of there, but the paint is loaded up in the brush. So then we'll take and stroke it onto the boat. And if I want to get a little bit more paint off the brush, I can rub it across the lap right there. And that'll dump a reservoir in that little corner right there. And then I can tip that out. That's working out pretty nicely, really. I couldn't expect it to come out much better than that. I'm applying the paint in both directions. I'm painting from forwards to aft and from aft to forward. You know, back and forth, because the paint is on both sides of the brush. I just don't see any need to apply the paint in one direction. Maybe tipping it in one direction makes sense, but not applying it in one direction. All right, next lap. Now you'll notice up in here that I actually do have some sags right up in here, but I think the paint is still wet enough for me to be able to tip it right out. So what I'm going to do is just take my brush. I'm not adding any paint, but I'm just tipping out what I've got there. So that knocks that run right down, and there's one right there. So I've knocked that one down as well, and that should do it right there. That should take care of that. So now I'm on to the next plank. Now this is really working out well for us. At this point I've decided to use the brush on the entire paint job. No need to use a roller here. As I paint along here, you can see that once in a while I'll scrape the brush across the lap, just like some people would scrape the brush off in their paint pot to dump some of the paint. I'm trying to dump a little bit of the paint out of the brush onto the lap, get a little extra paint on the lap there so that I can spread it out that much more easily. But it really is going on well, and it's going along fast enough, so I'm pretty happy. It's looking nice and shiny. I think we're doing the right thing. Now, because we thinned it out, we're able to tip back quite a ways here because it really hasn't gone off. Now, if we had applied it without thinning it, it would have already skinned off, and I wouldn't be able to tip it like this. So that worked out pretty well just like that. So just like that. I tipped my way back there quite a distance, really. So now I'm going to keep going here. Now, as I'm applying the paint here, I can tell that it's getting a little thicker as I go here. So some of the reducer is evaporating out of the paint. So I'm going to have to go back and put a little bit more reducer in it. As soon as I finish this lap right here, once I finish this lap and tip out a run that I see in the lap above it, then I'm going to go back and add a little bit more reducer. It's getting a little bit harder to tip, and I'm probably taking way too much time, but it's okay. And I thought I had a little run right there. Yeah, got rid of that one. There. Maybe up in here even. Yeah, see, that paint was pretty heavy still. So I'm going to take it back and put a little bit more reducer in it. So let's just add a little bit more special brushing thinner and mix that in. Now what a difference I'm noticing here. Just in one stroke I can tell right away that the paint is thinner and it goes down much easier. I don't have to work at it, you know. It's a little thinner, so maybe it doesn't cover quite the same, but it's got a little flow to it, so even though you can see through it when you brush it, it kind of fills in right after all by itself. So I can tell you for sure that the most important thing about this paint is to get it the right consistency or the right thickness. You know, like I said, right out of the pot, it's a little bit too thick. So I've thinned it a little bit. And like I said before as well, what happens is the thinner kind of dries out of it as you go along, right out of your pot. So once in a while, you may have to go back. Once you've noticed that it's going on a little too thick, you have to go back and thin it again. So I may have to return numbers of times over there to add thinner to this paint as I paint. Now it's going faster for me because it's just about right there. I might have had a little bit too much in it. It already evaporated the tiniest little bit. Now it's spreading just perfect. Nice. I love the feel of it when it's going on right. It's got a certain feel to it. Your brush just glides along without any effort whatsoever, and the paint just comes flowing right out of the brush. Ah, boy, painting's fun. It's really starting to look great now. It's quite a transformation from the flat white primer to the glossy white paint job. You can see a reflection of me in the paint. That's not really me. I'm up here painting the boat, but the glossy finish really starts bringing the boat to life, and it brings out the lines of the boat and really brings it into perspective. So it's starting to look fantastic. You'll notice that sometimes I'm spreading the paint from the wet onto the dry, and really what I'm trying to do is pull the paint down onto the dry so I can spread it out a little bit thinner. So I start on the wet and spread it towards the dry. Once I've got the paint applied on the surface properly and I think it's the right thickness, it's time to tip. Now, I don't tip in the same direction that I pull the paint down onto the dry. I end up setting my brush down on the dry and tipping up onto the wet because I'd rather lift the brush off the wet paint than set the brush down on the wet paint. When you set the brush down on the wet paint, for me, it leaves like a vertical mark at the tips of the brush, and I don't like that. So I tip from the dry and I lift off the wet, and that's the way I like to do it. Now, before I did this paint job, I went on YouTube and I watched some painting videos, quite a few of them actually. And you know, there's so many different ways and different opinions. It's just incredible. Some boats get rolled vertically and tipped horizontally. Some people like to roll horizontally, fore and aft, and then tip vertically. You know, I don't know how much difference it really makes, but this is the way I do it because we had laps involved. The roller would dump too much paint along the laps. I can't roll and tip it vertically. That just wouldn't work out. So what I'm stuck with is painting it fore and aft, plank by plank with a brush, and tipping it with the same exact brush. One more thing I'd like to point out is about the tape. Now, I remove the tape between every coat, and the reason why I do that is because if you let too much paint get out on top of that tape and dry, what happens when you go to remove the tape keeps ripping and you get like a little bit of a rough edge, and it just doesn't work out well. So what I like to do is let the paint start to tack up so that we make sure that it's not running or going to give you any trouble. Then I remove the tape early. That just makes it real easy to do, and believe me, it's easier to tape it off again than it is to remove a paint job or a tape job that's been painted over. Now I'm going to paint the starboard side of the boat, and I'm going to do exactly the same thing that I did on the port side. I'm going to start really at the very corner at the chine and paint the garboard plank out first. I'm going to make sure I get enough paint on the lap, the next lap. I'm going to stroke that out, tip that plank out first before I move on to the next one. I'm going to apply paint on the next one and paint the lap and tip that one out and move myself up the side, or down as you might call it. The boat is upside down. I'm going to paint plank by plank, just like I did on the other side. I'm going to make sure I get enough paint on the laps. I'm going to tip it out as I go, plank by plank. There's no question that's the way to do it. You wouldn't want to paint too far ahead and not be able to tip it, so plank by plank is the way to go. The last thing for us to do is to paint the transom. Now I'm going to apply the paint from the very bottom or up near the skeg all the way to the top, and just apply it, paint it in both directions if I want, get it spread on there really nice. I don't want too much paint on there, so I can go over it a little bit, move a little paint, and wipe it off in my pot, and then I'm going to tip it from the skeg right to the skull hole. There's our first coat of finish paint on the boat right now. Now it's awful shiny, it looks really nice. You know, the trick to all paint really is, like I said before, is to get it the right thickness. If you apply it too thick, you know, you can't spread it out, and it tacks off on the surface and then it runs underneath the surface. So, you know, this paint for sure works out really nicely if you do thin it down. As I thinned it more, the more I thinned it, the better it seemed to work. So the thing for us to do next is to just let it dry. We'll inspect it. We'll look and see if it's got any runs in it. We'll sand it a little tiny bit. I'm going to give it one more coat of finish paint before I'm totally satisfied, and it is going to look mighty white after that. And we're sneaking up on here where we're going to flip this boat over and do a little oil and varnishing, and I can't wait because it's going to be time to go for a row, and everybody's going to want to see that. I'm going to have as much fun as anybody living that day putting it in the water. So, you know, it's going to be fun. We'll have a drone overhead and different things, so it's going to be a gas. So stay with us because we're having a lot of fun and we want you to be with us.